Hyvät ystävät, dear friends, warmly welcome to the Helsinki Eco-Anxiety event. So we are a crowd of roughly 30 people here at Puistokadu 4. You will soon hear more about this place. And roughly 80 people have registered for the online Zoom part. My name is Panu Pihkala. I'm a Finnish eco-anxiety researcher and been much involved in organizing this. As the beginning, I just want to say warm thanks of gratitude to Kone Foundation, whose support of Elin Kelsey's Lauttasaari residency was a key part in leading to this event and its fulfillment. Also, warm thanks to the Majan Tor Nesting Foundation and Tiina and Anna Herling Foundation, who are behind Puistokadu 4. Many universities and organizations have also taken part at the preparation, but I'll keep this just short and just a warm thanks to everyone. Psychologist Kirsti M will facilitate the evening, but before inviting Kirsti here, we first want to give the floor to representatives of Puistokadu 4, the house in which we are now.
Okay, I'm just going to take my seat here. I love this. Am I talking to the camera or am I talking to you? I'm talking to everyone. Heartfelt welcome on my behalf as well. My name is Niina Ruotsalainen, and I'm here as part of Puistokadu, the chief experience officer, but mostly today I've been carrying things and setting up things and making coffee because we're in the process of opening our house. And we've had a couple of these events with people present here, and after such a long time, it feels lovely. I tend to get a little emotional, and I've almost cried a couple of times, but I'm going to try and actually not hold it back now because we're here about emotions after all. The house you're currently sitting in, the space, you're one of the first audiences to be here in person. And what we're doing here is we're getting ready to open up in August, and we have 3 floors with a whole variety of activities taking place inside. So we have the ground floor with meeting rooms that you can book. We have a beautiful restaurant opening in July. So for all of those who are in Finland or planning to visit Finland, welcome to our restaurant as well. We have this beautiful event space right here. We have rooms to work in. We have the headquarters of 2 of the foundations working with this project. We also have space, collaborative workspace for different actors working within the themes that Puistokadu deals with. And in addition to that, we have our beautiful science attic, which is a whole floor devoted to researchers and researchers working specifically within the sort of themes that Puistokadu is interested in. So one of the things that we are really kind of geared towards, and that's at the heart of Puistokadu as well, in addition to being the sort of space for science, but also the space for hope. And hope has a lot to deal with how we feel and what's happening on the inside, and the sort of perhaps opposite or also complementary idea of the hierarchical analytical knowledge. And I think it's beautiful that one of the first events that we're hosting here is about emotions. So on my part, on behalf of the whole house as well, welcome.
Okay, so we can start the event. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so excited that we got to be in this beautiful place, and Panu, that you organized this and that we have such a impressive line of talkers today. My personal research heroes are here, and also online, some of our online, and also we have some familiar faces here in the audience, which is great. So we will talk about eco-anxiety today. And as we know, there is a lot of discussion about eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. People are getting more and more worried, more and more anxious about climate threat. And also the research about these issues is also growing fast. And in this event, we will discuss research, we will discuss environmental communication, education, and what we know from research today and what needs to be studied more. We will also talk about practical ideas about how to encounter eco-emotions constructively. So this event will be recorded. I'm not sure if you were mentioned, you might know, and the video will be available afterwards as well. And so today we have 4 speakers. We have Professor Susan Clayton, who is from the College of Worcester in Ohio, USA, and has published many pioneering studies and reports about climate anxiety. And yes, so it's such a privilege that we have you here. Then we have on Zoom, we have Maria Ojala, who comes from Örebro University, Sweden. And she has also studied a long time climate worry and emotions, for example, climate hope for 20 years. And then we have also on Zoom, we have Elin Kelsey, who is from adjunct faculty member of University of Victoria, School of Environmental Studies from Canada. And she has developed educational resources for challenging the narrative of climate doomism and championing solutions journalism. And then we have Panu Pihkala, who already introduced himself, but he's from University of Helsinki, interdisciplinary scholar who has published many articles and books and book chapters about the topic. So each speaker will talk about 15 minutes, and then we will deepen into some discussion topics more. So then also you will have possibility to ask questions, and I will tell you more about how this happened when we go there. And then the discussion will be facilitated by Isabel Coppola, who is a bachelor student in environmental studies and political science, University of Vermont. And she has been working here for 10 months now, 10 months, right? So she was awarded a fully founded, sorry that I read it directly here. I'm so excited that I had to write it here so I don't forget anything. Research grant from Fulbright Finland Foundations for the academic year to study eco-anxiety here with Panu Pihkala. Okay, so we might want to start the presentations now. Susan?
Well, thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in Finland. This is my first time. It's a pleasure to be here in this space, and not just this physical space, but this space of people who are attending to the complex emotions around climate change, which is just really nice to see so much attention to this topic. And I really want to emphasize that idea that there's a context for thinking about and talking about climate change emotions. So next slide, please. We know that, of course, there are a lot of negative emotions surrounding any discussion or consideration of climate change. And these are some data from a study I was involved with along with Panu. We collected data from 10,000 young people around the world between the ages of 16 and 25, and asked them whether they felt these emotions when they thought about climate change. And as you can see, they're very negative, with 2/3 of them reporting that they felt sad, afraid, anxious, and only 1/3 saying they felt optimistic, and even slightly less saying that they were indifferent. So I actually think that's a good thing. But so we know that there is this essentially condition of negativity around climate change. Next slide. But again, our emotions are not just our own individual responses, but they exist within a social context. We talk to other people, and that helps guide how we feel about the issue of climate change. From the same study, we found a very striking finding that almost 50% of people did not trust governments to do the right thing. In fact, they said governments were betraying them. And the more they felt betrayed, the more they also reported worrying, the more they reported being functionally impaired by their concerns about climate change, and the more negative thoughts about climate change that they reported. So this feeling of betrayal is part of what's affecting people's other negative emotions. Their feelings that others, those in charge, are not doing what they should be. And then when it comes to talking to your friends or family, almost 40% said they felt that they were ignored or dismissed if they tried to talk to other people about climate change. But a lot of them said they didn't talk to anyone else. 20% said they didn't talk to other people about climate change. And my colleague Janet Swim has done research on social discussions around climate change. And this is something that she's also found, that a lot of people, and this especially in the US, maybe less so here, a lot of people do not talk about climate change to others because they feel that it's a controversial topic, or that will raise, people will be angry with them for bringing up such a negative topic. Next slide. So one reason I like to emphasize or to look at the social context is we can actually influence it. We don't just have to accept it. And when I'm talking to students and they say, what can I do? One of the things I try to emphasize is that they can talk to other people. They can try to change that social context surrounding climate change, and especially raise the level of awareness of the topic. But another way to influence the social context is to include it in our educational materials, in the ways that children are taught about climate change in the classroom. And educational contexts are so powerful here because every child experiences them, or almost every child. So it's a very powerful way to communicate about those emotions. Next slide. This is based on some research that one of my students, Cambry Baker, did a few years back. She was in Australia, and it was at the time of the bushfires. And there was a great deal of anxiety being expressed in Australia about these events. It was climate change made very salient, made very obvious. And so Cambry studied parents, and she asked them about whether they were talking to their children about climate change. Did their children want to talk to them about climate change? What were their concerns about whether they should be talking about it or not? And the parents reported, and she surveyed teachers as well as parents. Most people said they talked to the children about once a week, and that in fact, that's about how much the students wanted to hear about it. So there were these conversations going on. Next slide. The parents said they felt some hesitancy in having these conversations, particularly because of their own emotions, their own sadness or anxiety. They were afraid that they would magnify their children's anxiety because of these emotions. And so they worried that they would increase their children's anxiety. And these kinds of emotion-based reasons were much more important than other reasons like there's not enough time, or my children don't want to have the conversation. It was really this concern about the children's emotions. Next slide. But we also asked, do you think that parents should play a role in talking to the children about climate change? And what does that role look like? And absolutely, they said it was very important that parents would support their children in action and educate them about sustainability, support their feelings, and so on. So they tended to think that, and you could see the ratings from both teachers and parents, a little bit different, but very similar. This is what teachers and parents thought the parents should be doing. And next slide, please. They also thought that schools had an important role to play. So again, a slightly different role than parents, not surprisingly, that they should be emphasizing education and empowering the students, giving them support for action and essentially encouraging them to get involved, but also providing space and time for the students to talk about their feelings was something that at least some of teachers and parents thought was important. Next slide, please. So given these findings from Australia, that parents and teachers thought that there should be more discussions going on about climate change and about climate change emotions, both in the home and at school, we did a follow-up study to talk to the children. And it was a smaller study than we had hoped. There is practical difficulties, as there so often are. But we did talk to about 100 middle school children, so about 11 to 13 years old. And we asked them about their experiences of talking about climate change in the classroom. And this work, by the way, is very was very much inspired by Maria Ojala's work. So she may talk about some things that are related to this, and I certainly want to give her credit for it. We measured how the students perceived their teachers' discussions and whether the teachers were encouraging them essentially to get involved. And then some of their other responses, did they feel constructive hope as opposed to hope based on denial? Did they feel that they had efficacy, that they could make a difference? Did they feel anxious? And did they feel connected to nature? Next slide. And this is what it means for the teachers to show positive or negative emotions, emotional engagement. Teachers could essentially encourage the expression of anxiety from their students. So if a student would express something negative, the teacher would encourage them to say more and would listen to them. But other teachers could not take them seriously or even think the student was silly. And of course, this is the student's own perception. So hopefully the teachers don't really think the students are silly, but they might. Next slide. And then the teachers could also talk about climate change in a positive way. What can be done? How can you get involved? Or in a negative and hopeless way. So these are statements that the students responded to. Next slide. There was also a question of, in the classroom, did the teachers talk about the future? Did they orient the students towards what the future might look like? And what can you do to get to a more positive future? Next slide. And we asked the students just, what 3 words would you use to describe how you feel about climate change? These are their comments. As you can see, worried is the strongest. Worried is the strongest. Sad, scared, bad, but confused also very much. And I think that highlights that importance of education and support for the children. And we coded anybody who said even one positive word was a positive response. There were only 18. So if some of them said good or okay, but almost all much more negative. Next slide. In terms of whether or not the children felt hopeful, the things that seemed to be leading the children to feel hopeful were that positive framing from teachers, the emphasis in class on behavioral engagement and behavioral pathways, but also the students' own connection to the natural world and their perception of efficacy. Next slide. They were more anxious also if they were connected to nature. So that's a little bit of a dual pathway there. And they were less likely to be anxious when their teachers showed positive emotional engagement. So when their teachers essentially encouraged them to talk about their negative emotions, they were less anxious. And I think that highlights that when you try and suppress negative emotions, the children just think, this is even worse than I thought. They don't even want me to talk about it in some ways. Next slide. So in line with that idea that a connection to nature was associated with both hope and anxiety were actually positively correlated. And these are a couple of quotes from the children that shows how they were having these positive and negative emotions at the same time. I'm worried, but I think it should be fine. I try to do something because it's a problem, but I feel happy when I hear about people trying to fix it. So we really need to acknowledge the complexity of the emotions that children are experiencing and not try and assume that if it's negative, it can't be positive. And if it's positive, it can't be negative. Next slide. And I think Maria will talk more about this, but as we try and encourage hope and resilience among the children, trust in others is part of that. So again, getting back to that social context, that teachers and parents are just beginning to think about how can you support the emotional engagement that will allow children to be resilient. But this is a journey that the teachers and the students have to go on together. And I will stop there. I think that's my 15 minutes. Thank you very much. We're going to go right on to the next speaker.
We will take the discussions later. So yes, so yeah, so yes to your question. Yes. So thank you so much, Susan. That was very, very interesting, and I think also a very important message for us adults and also for school system, that we need to start thinking about this more and take it really seriously. And so then we have next speaker, Maria Ojala, who is on Zoom. Let's see if we get.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Do you hear me?
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Panu for inviting me to this very important event. And I'm also wanting to say that I'm sorry that I couldn't travel to Helsinki, which I planned to do. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an associate docent in psychology at Örebro University.
Maria, can you hear me? Just a second. There is something going on with the voice here. Sorry about this. Can you try to speak now?
Yes. Do you hear me?
No, sorry.
Let's see from my computer.
Okay, now it can be maybe fixed. Can you try again?
Hello?
Now we can hear you.
Now
It
you
wasn't
can
as loud as before, right?
Yes. Unstable. Do another try.
Yeah, well, there must always be some problems with technology, right? So I was thinking like it's going too well now.
Second. Let's see now.
Okay, let's try again. Can you say something?
Hello, hello.
Now.
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. You can continue.
Yeah, then I'm starting from the beginning. Hello, everyone. And I would like to thank Panu Pihkala for inviting me to this important event, and also say that I'm sorry that I couldn't travel to Helsinki, which I was planning to do. But now I'm here, and I'm going to talk about climate change worry and coping, implications for engagement and mental well-being among young people. And I have performed research about this topic for quite a long time now. I actually started with this already when I wrote my doctoral thesis, which I defended in 2007. And I focused a lot on what Susan was talking about hope and worry not being the opposites, but there is a complex pattern of emotions. And then, like 2 years after my doctoral dissertation, I started to focus on climate change specifically, because in my dissertation I focused on global environmental problems in general, so it could be other problems than climate change also. I would like to just say that if you are interested, besides being an associate professor and docent at Örebro University, I'm also a research director now for CES, Center for Environmental and Sustainability Social Science. So if you're interested in multidisciplinary research around this topic, please go into our homepage at Örebro University's homepage. The focus in my research has been quite a lot on worry. And we saw in Susan's excellent presentation that worry is something that young people emphasize. And that is also true in Sweden. But there are also other groups who worry. In Sweden, the group that has actually increased in worry during the latest year mostly is people over 65 years of age. So it seems to be the middle-aged cohort that doesn't take this problem seriously enough, perhaps, to worry that much. And Susan also mentioned The study that she and Panu was part of, also Caroline Hickman at Bath University, where they found that many young people were afraid and anxious, and I have kind of summarized that in the concept of worry. And worry, of course, is not only an emotion, but it's also related to cognitive aspects, to thinking in a critical way about the future. But the question then is, what does this worry stand for? Is it equal to low mental well-being in general also, or is it perhaps even something positive, for instance, a motivating force? And there is a tendency among lay people, but also researchers, to kind of equal worry directly with a medical state or something like that. But it's not that simple. We can see in some cross-sectional quantitative studies that there is an overlap between climate change worry and general depression, general anxiety. But there seems to be no relationship to life satisfaction, for instance. And of course, since there aren't that many studies still about this subject, there are more some cross-sectional studies, which I, together with some colleagues, reviewed in this article, but they are mostly cross-sectional. And many studies are more of a theoretical kind of review articles right now. So we need more studies to look at the relationship, because just because there is a relationship, it could be that climate change worry drives also general anxiety and general depression. But it could be the other way around, that it's actually people who are higher on anxiety and general depression that also gets very worried about climate change. Or there could be something else, like a personality factor that explains this relationship. So we need to look at that a little bit more in depth, I think. But also the relationship between climate change worry. The more worried you are, the more is the tendency to be active. And there are more studies in that field. But still, you need to look at it in a more in-depth manner. What does worry stand for, and how does it actually motivate engagement? And I'm actually going to do a study soon. I'm going to start this fall. We received a grant from the Swedish Research Council, DR, where we're going to look at what role does climate change worry play in young people's life, and also learning processes, because it's important to look at learning and education in this context. And I was very happy to see that Susan has done a kind of a replication and also extended that from the studies that I have done in Sweden about talking to teachers. In this study, we're gonna follow a little bit older group, senior high school students from the first year in school to the last year. So we're going to do 3 data collections, quantitative study, but also do an in-depth interview with young people who are highly worried to get at the kind of more complicated aspects. And we're going to look at this relationship then between worry and measures of mental well-being, but also different measures of engagement. And of course, when it's a longitudinal study, we can control for time, and we can get a little bit better insight in what comes first and so on, although it's not possible to look at causal relationships. But what is more important, we want to also look at factors that can kind of turn worry into positive force for learning and empowerment with a maintained overall well-being. And it could be coping, which I'm going to talk about soon, but also communication with teachers, trust, and connection to nature. And that Susan mentioned, it is also something that we're going to include, because we have a doctoral student that we hired recently, and she's very interested in that. And it's very important thing, as we also heard in Susan's presentation. And then we want to look at some factors that can possibly explain climate change worry, like values, gender, and personality factors. But talking about worry, I have actually more looked at how people cope with climate change worry. And what is coping then? Well, as soon as we as humans feel emotions, especially negative emotions, we do something with it, because it can be heavy to feel worried, of course, and we try to deal with it in different ways. And how we deal with these emotions could be more important actually than the emotion in its pure form. It's almost impossible to capture emotions in its pure form because we start to do something with it directly. And that could be perhaps more important for engagement and psychological well-being than the emotion in itself. So that is what I have focused on. And one of the first studies, or actually what I used, the overarching theoretical model was a specific model about coping, because there are many in psychology. And this was Lazarus and Folkman transactional model of coping. And they differ two different broad ways of coping in its original form. Problem-focused coping, then when you are worried, you kind of focus on the problem and cognitively perhaps think, what can I do? You talk with your friends about what you can do, not your emotions perhaps. And then you can also do something. I'm worried, so I stop eating meat, for instance, when it comes to climate change, or I really try to influence my parents to say that this is important. So indirectly, you also regulate negative emotions then. But then there are also emotion-focused coping. And that is often the case that you focus on your emotion and you try to kind of distance yourself from these emotions in different way. It could also be that you talk with your parents and friends about your emotion, but it was not common when I conducted my studies to do that concerning climate change. So actually, it could also be emotional avoidance, that you kind of deny the problem. And that is also present among young people when it comes to climate change. And I found that out in one of my early studies was where 3 groups of young people, children, late teenagers, and young adults who have scored high on worry, and some also scored high in hope. They wrote about worry and hope concerning climate change, and I coded it from the transactional model of coping and found a lot of more specific coping strategies. But I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about that I then took this and made up some quantitative measures of coping and related it to well-being and engagement. And what I found was that de-emphasizing, taking down the seriousness of the climate threat was related to a lower degree of environmental engagement, also to a lower degree of knowledge about climate change, and a lower degree of feeling that you can influence the problem. And in one study, it was also related to that you feel that you cannot influence societal problems at large. And then young people's cognitive problem-focused coping, where you think about what you can do, was positively related to a higher degree of environmental engagement, and they also felt that they could influence the problem. But in 2 studies, I also found that it was related to lower subjective well-being, or to be more specific, a higher degree of general negative effect. And that was explained statistically by that they worried more about climate change, but also that these kind of problem-focused strategies was very individualized. It was about what I can do, not about what we can do together. So that could also perhaps explain this. So then I asked, is there any other way to cope with climate change that is related to both well-being and engagement? And here I used a concept created by Susan Folkman, meaning-focused coping. She did a study with men who lived with a partner who was terminally ill with AIDS. And she measured negative emotions, of course, and they were all high on negative emotions. But out of a coincidence, she also measured positive emotions. And she found that one group of these men were high on negative emotions, but also high on positive emotions. And they kind of created this positive emotion by using different kinds of meaning-focused coping, as she called it. So meaning-focused coping is more related to the activation of positive emotions than to getting rid of negative emotions. And also when she followed up this group of male, many of them developed more chronic anxiety and depression, clinical signs of that. But the group that had used a lot of meaning-focused coping and that was high on positive emotions also, they managed much better. So I then started to think that it's important to investigate both how young people cope with negative emotions around climate change, but also to measure positive emotions, hope in this case. And then, of course, Susan Folkman argued that it is especially important when the stressor cannot be removed and solved at once. Then meaning-focused coping is important because problem-focused coping is not enough and could lead to increased stress because you cannot solve it, but you need to be active. So then I thought that perhaps that could also be true when it comes to climate change. Because, I mean, climate change, you need to be active because we are part of this problem, but you cannot solve it now, only at a collective level and far away in the future. So in order to have the strength to continue being active and face your worry, well, then it's perhaps good with meaning-focused coping. And I identified 3 different strategies when I analyzed the stories of hope that the young people talked about. Positive reprisals, they had the capability to see the problem and acknowledge it. So it's not denial, but then switch perspective and see positive aspects, like that climate change knowledge has increased in society at least, that we have solved difficult problems before, and so on. There was also a kind of defiant existential hope. These young people were rather pessimistic, but they forced themselves to be hopeful. So they said that no hope, no reason to live. I forced myself to be hopeful. And finally, there were trust in different societal actors to be, for instance, have high trust in science, technological development, and some of these young people have also met some politicians, at least one politician who takes this seriously, and they focus on that, trusting climate change organizations and so on. And then I also included this in quantitative studies, and I found that meaning-focused coping was actually positively related to environmental engagement and efficacy, as well as all measures of subjective well-being. And we also work with a database right now showing the same results that we collected in 2019 and 20, just before the COVID-19 crisis. And in a study with children, actually, those who used a high degree of problem-focused coping, and remember that that was related to negative effect to a certain extent, if they also used meaning-focused coping, this buffered the relationship. But we didn't find this in a group of teenagers. So just some questions, because I'm ready now, but I think it's important to get a better insight about the relationships between climate change worry and engagement and mental well-being. It's also important to think about how to create a more reliable measure of meaning-focused coping that works in different cultural contexts and over different time periods. Because trust in politicians, for instance, is different in Sweden than in Russia, for instance. And also how to promote meaning-focused coping and constructive hope, of course, how to do it, and we need more intervention studies, and we will probably discuss this a little bit later on here. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. Very interesting, and we will discuss later about this. Really important to think that we are in the middle of a crisis, and it's normal that we feel anxious, but that there might be some ways to handle this and help other people to handle these emotions. So we will deep into them more later. Thank you so much for this talk. And then the next one is Elin Kelsey. Do we have Elin online?
Hi, yes, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much for those 2 wonderful first presentations. I always find it hard once the workshop begins because the work is so provocative and interesting. You want to be with what has just been said instead of what you're about to say. So thank you for such a stimulating start to the day. I'm just going to share my screen with you. And and sort of continue on. But just before I do that, I would very much like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, Lekwungen speaking peoples, which is an utter privilege to be able to be in this place and with you today. And you might know this area by its English language name, which is Victoria in British Columbia. So to really jump right beyond what we've been talking about this morning, or continuing on from what we've been talking about this morning, I think what's really interesting in terms of context, and I guess I'm bringing in some ways a communication lens to this, is that one thing Panu and I have been talking about since I joined him in Helsinki is this idea of youth self-identifying around their mental health. So I noticed in this last year, for example, students here along the Pacific Northwest in North America, identifying themselves not only with gender pronouns, but in terms of their eco-anxiety and other sorts of perhaps mental health issues that they are facing. And so I started looking, is this unusual to the Pacific Northwest, or is this happening in other places? And so, for example, the World Economic Forum has this piece talking about how this younger generation are less shy to talk about these experiences. And again, I think, as Maria so beautifully pointed out, this may be different in different places, but I think it's really worth looking at what is happening around identity as these feelings are so widely being felt. And I think part of it too is that where we look has such a big impact on what we see. And so as we look onto the online world, into the social media aspect of this, we see increasing nuance of the ways people are talking about their experiences. So of course, online communication is fraught with difficulties, and it becomes a place where we can see more nuance, more complexity. Just as our first two speakers so beautifully said, these issues are not straightforward, they're complex. And I think it really behooves us as researchers, and I should say my talk is really coming from Panu's beautiful invitation to look at our work and where it might be heading. We can look online on Instagram, for example, and see a lot of work being put forward in terms of how do we talk about these things ourselves in our own voices as youth. Or we see memes, for example, and researchers looking at how is eco-anxiety portrayed on different social media platforms. What does it look like in these different places? That whole question of our identity in relationship to our ecological emotions, I think brings to the fore this question of trust, which both Susan and Maria have touched on in important ways. We see a decrease in trust in institutions, and we see at the same time an increase in trust amongst young people around social media influencers. So they see themselves within the people who are speaking. And I think what's interesting to me about these influencers is they are talking about their whole lives. Now, of course, again, we can look at how authentic are these portrayals. There's all sorts of complexity there as well. But this diversity of lives with more nuance and more intimacy is something that is leading to higher trust than what we see in these more traditional institutions. And that's led me to just beginning this project, which is looking at how we look at evidence-based hope. And by that, I mean the kind of hope where we can look at, how many people are doing this sort of activity, what's the rise in these kinds of engagements, where we can chart that shift moving in the kinds of directions we want things to be going. So evidence-based hope and the kinds of solutions that are emerging from that, and bringing together youth and social media around this so that we actually are creating that kind of dialogue in a social media platform in the same way that we need to be doing it in mainstream media and in schools. Talking about coping, I thought it was interesting that what we're seeing in the media realm is, again, this news avoidance. And so just earlier this month, just about 10 days ago, I guess it was, this report that shows an increase in news avoidance. And again, in this case, Reuters is looking at a US population for this study, but in that case, we're seeing a rise in news avoidance. That's a real issue, of course, when we think about coping. And I know there are a number of self-care checklists that suggest to people that they should, if they feel anxious about the environment, stop looking at the news. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think what we need to do is not stop looking at the news, but be looking at constructive journalism or solutions journalism rather than problem identification journalism itself. So one of the things we see, for example, is that if you are taking in traditional media, then you tend to be avoiding what's happening. But if you are taking in solutions journalism, which is looking at a rigorous way with an evidence base, we actually see that people are more likely to feel that they can directly engage with these issues. So I think we're seeing quite a parallel between what Susan and Maria are talking about in educational contexts, seeing the same thing happening within media contexts. I think the other thing that's really interesting about solutions journalism as it relates to these questions of emotions is that solutions journalism also allows for more complicated, nuanced narratives of traditionally disempowered or disenfranchised groups of people. And so whose voices we're hearing, we're more likely to hear them within solutions journalism stories than we are within problem identification stories. One of the key things that really drives all of my work is this belief, is that our feelings about these issues are based absolutely on the reality of the situation. We are facing urgent issues. There's no question about that whatsoever. And I think this important second point, which is that our thoughts and our feelings and our beliefs and our mindsets, they're all influenced by how we communicate these things and how we take in that communication. And that leads me to be extremely interested in this point, which is this social construction of hopelessness. So, for example, we know that the number one way that people learn about climate change is through the media. And I was just speaking with David Bornstein, who's the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, which is now a massive network working in many, many countries around the world. And we see this, 2 to 3% of coverage involves even a mention of a solution. So what that means is that almost all the information we take in about climate is in this problem identification way. And so to my mind, we are not dealing with when students are having these feelings, when young people are having these feelings, when those seniors in Sweden are having those feelings, it is coming through a mediated source in which we are only almost entirely hearing about the problems and almost nothing about the kinds of solutions that are actually happening and are having a meaningful impact. In that sense, I feel like, and I've used this slide before in a Kone Foundation presentation, but it's so powerful to me, this idea of the wounded angel. I'd really like to talk more in our session today about this construction of hopelessness in a form, to me, is a form of wounding. And it's coming from a blindness that we are inadvertently creating by being so heavily focused on problems. So we're inadvertently causing blindness amongst those of us who are concerned with the climate, regardless of our age, because of this heavy emphasis on problem identification, both in our media sources and in our universities and in our public schools. And what that ends up doing is it creates such a dominant focus on fatalism and this idea that the future is already, it's already ruined. Those ideas of we are beyond hope, those sorts of things. Now, fatalism really matters in terms of engagement, which is, again, what we've been talking about today. We see studies such as this, that if we really believe that in fatalism and that climate change is unstoppable, we are less likely to engage in the kinds of behaviors we need to do, even if we care deeply about them. And so these messages of the social construction of hopelessness is not only a significant and serious issue of well-being and mental health, it's a serious issue of climate engagement. So some of the things I think are worth paying attention to or thinking about is what might it look like to create learning experiences that are based within evidence-based hope. So just in this last month, for example, I did a whole school project, students between kindergarten and grade 5, a project based in the community in which they live. So the city of Victoria sits along a large inland sea, the Salish Sea. And we started with this premise of this piece of news, that humpback whales have really been significantly recovering over the last 10 years. In fact, over the last 10 years, the population of humpback whales in this area has increased 14-fold. And so we had, less than 200 animals, and we now have, many more than 2,000 animals. So talking with children about these kinds of changes that they may not see in their local environment, but actually are happening and are scientifically, there's scientific data to support that they're happening. And then inviting those students to write about their feelings around what they feel about the ocean, what they feel about climate change, what they feel about these examples of resilience that are also occurring, and creating self-portraits out of found materials to focus on our connections to nature, those sorts of activities, and then doing a public writing campaign with chalk on the streets around the city, talking about their feelings. In this case, a child talking about finding it amazing. And I think the earlier point that Susan made, many children write about that they are worried that the number of whales will go down again at the same time as they are hopeful that those numbers of whales are increasing. So that same complex set of emotions is there. I think that the point that I really try to underline is that information is changing all the time, and that one of our key roles as educators, where it's very hard to do this, but I think it's essential to all of this, is that we must be timely. So understanding that whale populations are increasing tells a very different story than if we think they are ruined or constantly on the decline. And if we are following, for example, right now, the rise of interest around net zero, this is from just yesterday, I believe, a UK initiative looking at large advertising agencies and the companies that advertise on them in the UK has now been moved to a global platform. And so as those companies all sign on to net zero pledges by 2030, they're also committing to using their advertising to promote climate engagement. So I think the stories we tell have such a difference in the sense of what is happening and how do we magnify it. And so I think staying up to date is really crucial to that. The other thing I think is really crucial is watching how things shift in terms of people's responses. So for example, our understanding of once we got to net zero earlier than 2020 amongst the scientific community was even when we got to net zero, there'd be a long delay before we saw a positive impact. The current idea as of 2021, and which is influencing the scientific modeling now, is that when we get to net zero, it's going to have a positive impact very quickly. Knowing that that science is changing as we learn more is also important to how we feel about our prospects. And I think what's interesting is this sense of trust that Susan was raising early on around institutional betrayal, and which Maria was just talking about, this self-defiant hope. We really see that happening just within the last 6 months or so within the social media realm. So doomism, Michael Mann, the climate change scientist, has been talking about the dangers of climate doomism, because if we believe climate change isn't happening through denial, we don't have to act. But if we believe we're already doomed, those fatalistic views, why would we act? Because we're already doomed. And so youth now seeing these ideas of doomism as being a political ploy that is being used against them is actually opening up a moment, I think a very pregnant and important moment, when youth are saying, hey, I am willing to look at what is happening in an evidence frame around hope and around solutions orientations, because I do not wish to be presented with this doomist narrative that is a political means. So again, jumping into what's happening in social media, what are the conversations that are happening there around hope, around doom, around solutions, and what's happening within the scientific realm and how we bring that all to bear. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Elin. Very very inspirational to hear. And I think it also points out what we have been hearing from Susan and from Maria as well, that people are worried, but at the same time, we can also bring out talk about feelings and also talk about things that are happening to the good direction, so to say. So I forgot to introduce myself earlier. So actually this fits here. So I'm Kirsti M and I work at the Institute for Future Studies with climate change psychology. And the idea of our research institute, which is an independent research institute, is to study topics or events that might have influence for the different futures that we have, because future is not set. So now we know that climate change is a serious threat, but we don't know yet how serious the threat is. We still have many alternative futures that might expect us. So what Elin also brought up, that we can also come up, also bring to the discussion that things are also happening, and there are also some things that are providing some hope. So very, very interesting. And now we have our last presenter, Panu Pihkala, who will, yes.
Warm greetings once more, everyone, and warm thanks to Susan and Maria and Elin for the wonderful presentations. I also want to acknowledge that all of these three speakers have had a profound role for my own thinking and work. So thanks for all the work during the years. So I want to bring some Finnish perspectives. Yes, you can put on the next slide. Is this the Finnish emotional atmosphere? This is a classic painting by Akseli Gallela. The old hero is looking towards the lake. The boat is sort of broken. The tree trunk seems to laugh or even represent the biting of time. Birds are flying over the water and the seasons are changing. Well, this melancholic element is something in Finland also, but that's not the only emotional tone, luckily. And in addition to so-called environmental melancholy, we have a profound array of various emotions. So some indicators of where we are in Finland in relation to eco-anxiety and its very prevalent form, climate anxiety. In the Finnish National Youth Barometer, the data was collected 2021 and published in March 2022. The phrase, I have spoken about climate anxiety with others, was answered affirmatively by 61% of these young people from 15 to 29-year-old. So it tells that this is a topic very much discussed among Finnish young people. It doesn't say how many of them feel it or to what extent, but it tells of the social reality. The phrase, I feel sadness because of the loss of biodiversity and species extinctions, got a huge 76% yes answer. Personally, I think that this testifies both to the empathy in young people and the fact that they realize what's going on, and probably also for social desirability. It may be that in the contemporary world, people are thinking that what kind of person would I be if I wouldn't say that I care about species loss and other issues. So that may be one element there also. We have done a research article on these and a couple of other emotion-related questions at the Youth Barometer, together with Kirsti, our wonderful facilitator, and Julia Sangervo. That's currently available only in Finnish, but hopefully we'll get something out of it in English too. So the main themes will be today's talks, a couple of words about the Finnish context, also about research that's going on around here, and a few few observations about global research. So first, about the Finnish context. There are some special features about the Finnish discourse about eco-anxiety. And by the way, for the Zoom listeners, if you think about why I'm nodding all the time, is that's my sign to Kano, our wonderful technical person, who will then put on some animations in the slides. We did have a start in more national discussion about eco-anxiety, ympäristöahdistus in Finnish in the autumn 2017. So that gave us some time before identity politics and polarization started to make things more difficult, especially around the term climate anxiety beginning from fall 2018, and especially the parliamentary election in Finland in the early winter 2019. But that period made possible some connections between people in the countryside and cities, for example, and the political lines were not so dividing. So I think that helped us in Finland. The Finnish equivalent of eco-anxiety, ympäristöahdistus, which is literally environment anxiety, we like to put words together in Finnish language, is not understood by most people in a pathological sense. So we have some survey data also about that. There are many kinds of research going on many fields, regrettably mostly in Finnish, but there are also some contributions in English. About various eco-emotions, there are also some special features you can put on. There's a broadening range of various emotions and feelings that's been studied and discussed in Finland in relation to ecological issues. It should also be noted that the Finnish word tunne does not differentiate between emotion and feeling, so that's a combination of both. I did a monograph in Finland about various eco-emotional tones. Glenn Albrecht's influential work was one resource for that. That's the cover, sort of Earth in Mind, Mind in Earth type of book. And some of that is available in English in this research article, which came out in January, called Toward a Taxonomy of Climate Emotions. So various emotional tones are found there. There's a long table where I do some classifications. This is not a taxonomy in the natural science manner, but still putting some forms together. So there's surprise-related emotions, threat-related emotions, sadness-related emotions, and then also including lots of so-called positive emotions, but just hinting to those of you who want to read more about that. A couple of words about the Finnish language and culture. We have a lively vocabulary of emotions and feelings. Some emotion words which are especially useful for eco-emotions, such as haikeus and riittämättömyyden tunne. I'm afraid that the latter one will not have very much international appeal due to some etymological problems, but the content might. So riittämättömyyden tunne means feeling inadequate. So it's not exactly guilt or exactly shame, but it's the experience that many people have in relation to the ecological crisis, which is that the demands are so high that people feel that they can't be enough or do enough. So it's a sort of combination of these two. Haikeus is a very typical Finnish emotion related to both reacting to loss and changes with certain sadness, but also feeling gratitude for the things that they have existed. So, and that's something that I think many people feel often amidst the ecological crisis. Naturally, other languages have other strengths. For example, the English expression feeling overwhelmed, which is not so easily captured in Finnish language. As I mentioned, in our language, it's easy to make combinations of words, and that's something to play with. There's, for example, talvisuru, which would be winter grief, hellekauhu, which would be a horror of heat waves, and ympäristötoivo, which has actually been used in psychological research, also a concept of ecological hope or environmental hope. So that's some glimpses of the Finnish context and culture and language. And now a couple of words about Finnish research related to these topics. The surveys, interviews, noting, for example, in both youth studies and environmental education studies. Also interesting fieldwork among environmental activists, and Isabel Coppola, who is today facilitating the chat, has been doing that very recently. There are theoretical writings. I'll mention, for example, the philosophy of environmental education done by Antti Saari from University of Tampere, which deals also with many difficult eco-emotions. Personally, I've been focusing on a theory of eco-anxiety and eco-emotions. If somebody wants to take a more look on that, this article called Eco-Anxiety and Environmental Education brings together much of that and also discusses some Finnish examples. I wanted to share a couple of words about this National Climate Emotions Survey done in 2019, which is quite rare also internationally. The preparation team consulted Kirsti, who is here today, and myself, Kantar Tienes, did the actual study with more than 2,000 people. So there was lots of questions in this survey on the border of being too many. There's a summary of results in English available online. So I'll not go into this in very much detail, but point out to some interesting dynamics. Perceived happiness and assessment of the future was studied. Concern and possible anxiety and emotions about climate change, but also about ways of coping. It was asked that what kind of practices or coping methods help people if they experience difficult climate emotions. And here's one of the very interesting statistical charts from that survey. This is self-observation of emotions evoked by climate change in oneself. And so on the top, there's the emotion words which gained most self-recognition. In this case, it's interest, followed by frustration, sense of inadequacy, which is this riittämättömyyden tunne, powerlessness, hope, grief. So we already see that there's many emotional tones there. There would be a lot to say about these results, as is typical. Women self-recognized more emotions than men in most cases, but not all. Age had a role, and also many other dynamics. We can discuss this more hopefully later. Some observations: there is polarization, but many Finns think that anxiety terms describe well their experience of the ecological crisis and climate crisis. And my interpretation is that couple of facts I discussed earlier have an effect on this. One is the broad sense of the word anxiety in Finnish culture, that it doesn't refer just to strong anxiety forms. And another reason is probably the existence of public discourse on eco-anxiety, which deals with different forms of it and not just the strong forms. There is a lesser but still very significant number of people who self-report feeling strong psychosomatic symptoms. And together with Kirsti and Julia, we are working on academic articles on this data also, but COVID has slowed things down. Also, many instances of what I call practical eco-anxiety come up in Finnish observations. And I think that's also related to research design and the public discourse. Perhaps in Finland, people have been a bit more observant about the possibility of practical eco-anxiety than in some other places where there hasn't been so much discussion. That's my hypothesis at least. Many climate emotions are self-recognized, but psychosocial dynamics clearly have a role. For example, young people recognize more climate shame than older people. I think that there must be psychological defenses around by doing critical analysis of the behavior and reactions of older people. There's many instances of climate guilt and shame seen, but not self-recognized. Social dynamics have a role, but as for example, Susan and Maria commented, and Elin also. So if your social group approves or does not approve of saying out loud or recognizing climate emotions, that's going to have profound effect on people. And probably also the different levels of emotional literacy or emotional skills. For example, in Finland, young people have had much more education in emotional literacy than older people. And when you combine that with the complexity and difficulty of many climate emotions, such as shame, that may explain some of the results. So finally, a couple of words about the global research. I'm checking the time from my trusted Nokia and noticing that I have a couple of minutes left. So again, for more than I can say here, there's a recent commentary called 3 Tasks for Eco-Anxiety Research. From the same team number, you'll find Maria Ojala's commentary also for another paper in that team number. So I'm asking, what kind of anxiety are the various studies exploring? Second, raising up the importance of coping, which has already been mentioned many times today. And third, as a special theme, the role of emotional skills, and a couple of words soon about that to close it. I think we need both surveys and interviews and observations, so echoing some of the points that have been said already. And eco-emotions are complex. We should avoid overly simple expectations of, for example, action tendencies. And now I'm echoing Susan, for example, here. An interesting question for future research would be bundles of emotions or combinations or assemblages. This reminds me of the language in affect studies, which is an interesting area. So that would be interesting to study and think about more. So these complex combinations of emotion-focused and problem-focused methods bring us to the point that sometimes there in the contemporary world is a bias against emotion-focused coping. It's not just avoidance, and even avoidance is not always a bad thing, as Maria Ojala, for example, has very insightfully discussed in a recent article by her about teacher education and critical emotional awareness. And also today, Maria mentioned that talking to others is one form of constructive emotion-focused coping. But because we haven't had many structures in societies or communities which would have endorsed such activities, it's no wonder that they don't show up very well in studies. And this has led some scholars, not Maria or Susan or Elin, to presuppose that the emotion-focused motives are mostly related to problematic avoidance. And I think that is problematic. So about constructive emotional methods, more attention to these would be needed. In Finland, there is, for example, reading circles about eco-emotions. Eva-Stina Kinnunen is one of the scholars who has been studying that. There's been creative writing workshops, for example, by Henna Laininen. Participatory drama, Anna Lehtonen is one of the practitioners and scholars of that. Some other emotion-focused methods also used by myself. So this would be interesting to study the practical results of these kind of more constructive, I would say, emotional methods. There's also many projects going on. I want to just briefly mention, for example, Hope and Action educational project. Pinja is here today, also present. Interesting empirical eco-criticism project led by Toni Lahtinen in the literature sciences, also present here, and many others. Also, to close with, we have the National Eco-Anxiety Project in social and health sectors. In our provocatively titled podcast, together with environmental psychologist Thomas Doherty, Climate Change and Happiness, we discuss both sadness and happiness and other emotional tones. The latest episode actually discusses this eco-anxiety work in Finland, featuring Sanni Saarimäki and Taneli Saari, who are also present here today. So if you want to hear more about that, there's a podcast episode available, and a bit more older episode from a couple of months ago featuring Susan. So there's communication about that. But with those words, I thank you for the attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the rich discussion that I hope this all will provide. Thank you.
You can stay here if you want, or if you don't want, it's okay too. So we are now done with the talks. It was really interesting, right? So now what will happen now is that this is also the place where you can breathe a bit, because now there is only just practical information. So you can also stand up maybe if you want, or something, if this brings up the energy. So we will go into discussions now, and the idea of the discussions is that we have some themes that we will discuss. There are some themes that we will discuss. We will talk about, right, as Panu just mentioned quite a much, the complexity of emotions, the complexity of putting names to the emotions. It's a huge task. And then the cultural context influences, and so of course the events like this is a great start to look into that when we have scholars from Finland, Sweden, USA, Canada, and so it's a great thing that we have exchanged on this. So we will first discuss about feelings, emotions, how to measure them, how to understand them. Then we will go to coping, and particularly for constructive hope, evidence-based hope, how to promote them, and what are problems with them. Then we will discuss about creating space and time to feel and talk. As Panu mentioned, it's not so obvious that we today have such spaces today, the importance of them. And then within all of these topics, we might want to discuss something about climate communication and education. But in the end, I think we can also look into a bit more if there is something that we missed, how we can promote, communicate these issues in society and educate. So yes, so this is the point. And then both chat people and room people are can ask questions. And for the room people, if you have like a new question, you can just raise your hand. If you have follow-up question, do like this. So I know that I might put you in the queue before these people. And then in the chat, can you please, let's take Isabel here. Right. Okay, so let's you can maybe go here, and then we have. Shall we take the microphone? Okay. So yeah, sorry, chat people, you had to wait for a long time to hear how you can ask questions. So now it comes. So Isabel has like a really great overview of the chat. So she sees your questions there. So write your questions. So don't use the raise your hand function. So then we will pick up the questions as the discussion goes on. And Maria and Elin, you can use the raise hand function when you want to add some comments there. So then we can keep on track when you have questions.
Should we start with the questions they have?
Right. So I think we can go through the themes.
Okay,
yeah. So we start with, so that we have some, we don't need to kind of like follow exactly the themes, but kind of to structure the discussion. So, okay. Does everybody know what will happen? Okay, cool. So then we can start with this really, really difficult question that I think all of us who do studies about the topic and work on the topic at some level feel that emotional life is so rich, so complicated. We have emotions that are quite fuzzy, that overlap. Sometimes people don't even themselves know when they feel emotions, and if they do, it might be difficult to know where they come from. And so this is, of course, quite tricky in studying climate emotions. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about this in general, and I also have some specific question here that you might want to answer, or something else that you want to bring up. So like, let's say, for example, do you have recommendations about which emotions we should focus on in society and research? For example, should we focus on anxiety or worry? And in hope, for example, and should we maybe try to kind of like differentiate them even more? Like, let's say, instead of talking about hope and constructive hope and so on, could there be a name for constructive hope that is kind of like self-evident, more to say? And how should we try to define and measure them? It's quite a large question where you can bring up anything that you like, kind of. Okay, so does anyone want to start? First, we take some from our talkers' ideas.
I'll start off maybe while some of the online people are thinking about what to say. This is not a question that I think has, one answer. I think it depends on your goals, and sometimes we really just want to fully understand what people are experiencing, but sometimes we might have more specific goals. So there might be a reason for focusing on a particular emotion, such as hope or anxiety, because it has significance for something else like action or mental health. So that's my initial thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that, Susan. And my initial thought is related to a project I've been engaging with, which is trying to conceptualize a sort of process model of eco-anxiety and ecological grief, which would be simple enough, but not too simple, and so that there would be enough room for fluctuation and changes in moods. And I think that dynamic would be important in relation to the question, because the overall place that the person is bound to have a big impact on the emotions. For example, in the autumn 2018, many Finns reached a kind of climate realization or awakening. And for studies done then, there's lots of feelings of shock and perhaps lots of moral outrage and wanting to do something right away. And then now, after even a couple of years, the general emotions are partly different because of all the dynamics. So this is a very simple example of how the phase and the contextual situation in the world has an effect also.
Maria had raised her hand.
Yes, yes, Maria.
Yes, I just want to say that, of course,
Or we can
the
hear
question-
you. Sorry, all the things come for you. Just a second.
Do you hear me now?
Now, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, good. It's perhaps a slowdown when I put off the mute. Of course, as a researcher, we need to measure something that is actually unmeasurable, I would say, because emotions are very hard to capture, especially with the quantitative measures. But one thing that I have done in my studies is to not take like coping measures from the... Sorry. Not to take coping measures, for instance, or measures of emotions from the general literature about anxiety or coping. Instead, start with qualitative studies, start from the bottom up, trying to kind of listen to what young people say and then develop quantitative measures from that. And that, of course, needs to be done because it's also contextual, as Panu pointed out. So you need to kind of always do new qualitative studies and in different contexts, and then try to develop as good measures as possible, I think.
Yes, thank you. Very, very important. And that's, of course, is quite demanding. So, yeah, we should try to somehow collaborate internationally also to do that. Are there some emotions that you feel that we should focus more on in research, or that has been kind of neglected in maybe also in discussions? Did Elin, by the way, have any comments yet? No, sorry. Right. Okay. So does the public have any? Okay.
Okay, so we have a question from Jack. The first question is, what lessons can be drawn from the past for engaging today with eco-anxiety and emotions? For example, the angst felt in prior decades about nuclear annihilation, caution about presentism, where the current moment is at risk of being overemphasized.
Maria, yeah.
Yes, I was actually, do you hear me? Yeah, good. Yeah, I was actually going to answer Kirsti's question first, because I was thinking about that and was too slow to put up my hand. But I think that if there are some emotions that we have not looked at that much, it's a very strong focus on the kind of overarching anxiety, hopelessness, but also what Panu mentioned in his presentation about this kind of feeling overwhelmed or inadequate, that I think is very much kind of something that young people seem to feel today. And that is also related to practical things, to the feeling that you cannot influence really. And what seems to be sad is that, I mean, it seems like studies showing that at least in Sweden, young people have been worried for a long time, but it hasn't increased. But what seems to increase in my studies, for instance, is this kind of hopelessness and feeling kind of that you cannot influence. And then, of course, as Elin pointed out, it will lead to that you kind of distance yourself. And right now, I don't know what is happening in Sweden, at least, but I think that there could be a backlash right now where young people kind of go back from climate change and because they feel that they can't do anything. Hopefully not.
Thank you, Maria. Elin has maybe a hello there, or yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, to take the point of talking about nuclear concerns and presentism, I like that term very much. I think what's really challenging in all of this to me is that we have a very poor understanding of what is happening. And so all of our emotions sit within that context. So for example, one could look and say, oh, all of these fears around nuclear proliferation, and now we're just seeing the same thing with climate change, as if that was episodic and sort of disappeared. And I think what's important is that we find ways as educators, as media coverage, which again is why I'm so interested in solutions journalism, is setting a bigger context, because the understanding of what's happened with nuclear deproliferation as a result of that incredible movement, and then the kinds of studies that show us that these UN agreements or multinational agreements over long periods of time actually have tremendous impact. They're very effective. And yet we often don't share that information because our media coverage is very episodic. We know, for example, that climate change kind of disappeared off the radar in a media eclipse during COVID-19. And that can lead us to the false understanding that people stopped caring about climate change. Our research shows that's not the case. And so for me, what's so problematic is that all of these emotions sit in response to an understanding, a reality of the world that is in fact not real. It is a media construction that is based on heavy emphasis on problems, almost no awareness of solutions, and no sense of trends and changes over time. And so that's the piece I think we just really have to sort out, because if we don't do that, then we are doing careful and important work around these very true feelings and emotions people are having. And we are allowing that to happen within a context that is not rooted within a fulsome understanding of the kinds of things that are happening on the planet, to the better and for the worse. And so that would be my contribution.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting discussion. And just to clarify for everyone, it's a bit difficult here to decide where to look at, because there's the audience and the screen and the camera. So if you see us wandering, so we are not bored, but we are just confused, as contemporary humans tend to be, I think. So the question of nuclear war anxiety comes up in nearly all speaking assignments I do, if there's enough room for Q&A. And I think it's very important one, because it seems to be the closest parallel to eco-anxiety. There's a global threat, which is real. There's something that can be done, but on an individual level, you can't solve it, like Maria was saying about the different situations for coping. And Maria has done some of this in her research also, looking back at studies in the 80s of how young people cope or did not cope with the nuclear war threat, for example. And I think even more studies could be done comparing where in those situations. For example, there's people commenting from the 80s that if their parents joined peace demonstrations, that helped with the anxiety, or even took the kids with them. And of course, that's very ambiguous, as scholars of history know about these peace demonstrations, but that points to the role of efficacy that Susan was also mentioning. It helps when you are able to feel that you are collectively part of doing something to alleviate the problem. And this has been a strong point in Elin's work, of course. But in communicative situations, I often encounter problems between generations in this sense, because people who survived the nuclear war anxiety time, which is not completely over yet, but the most burning days, at least temporarily, are. So when they try to say that to the younger generations easily feel that now our concerns about the climate crisis and ecological crisis are not taken seriously enough. So that's a tricky situation for communication, and just wanting to name that. And I think there might be important things to learn between generations, but it's tricky.
Yeah, Maria. Go ahead.
Yes, very interesting discussion. I just want to say something about worry about nuclear war. Yes, as Panu mentioned, when I started my research, when I did my doctoral studies, there were hardly any studies about worry about global environmental problems. So I referred a lot to worry about nuclear war. There was a big kind of theme in the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, because there's always a time gap before you kind of publish your studies. I just wanted to say that in this study, longitudinal study that I said in my presentation that I'm together with colleagues will conduct and start to collect data and follow young people. We also want to look at other societal wars. And of course, now when it comes to the kind of war in Ukraine, which is kind of close to Sweden and also Finland, of course, we want to include questions about that also, and to see the overlap with climate change, anxiety, if there are the same persons that worry about these risks and so on. So we're gonna look at that also in a more, like Elin so nicely put it, in a more holistic kind of way, because as Elin mentioned, I mean, the media is very important, but we kind of fool ourselves. We think that people are not interested in climate change, but young people have been worried for a long time. So there are other groups perhaps that wakes up when the media gets kind of talks a lot about it.
So another question is kind of a general, she would like to hear if you have any thoughts on feelings about feelings in terms of climate change. For example, experiencing shame because one's feelings about climate change differ from what they think is, quote, the right thing to feel.
I don't have any information about that except what Panu has already mentioned, that idea that there is an awareness of what is the right way to feel, and that might affect what people say. But I haven't personally run into anybody saying, I feel bad because I'm not feeling the right thing, but probably if they do, they're not going to tell me.
Yeah, I think the person asking the question is asking a very good one. It hasn't been much studied up to my knowledge either, as Susan says. In the sort of studies based on observations, it's easy to see the effect of emotion norms, that in some cultures, for example, people might be a bit shamed to have climate sadness, for example, because of social norms. So there are some observations about dynamics, but I think it would need to be studied a lot more. And some of these norms are gendered, of course, also. So this links with the critical cultural studies, which has been an important element in Maria's work again, for example.
Yes, Maria, you're welcome. Ask.
Yes. Well, yes, that's a very interesting question. I'm very interested in social norms around emotions and how that influence how people talk about emotions, but also what they feel. But there are, as both Susan and Panu pointed out, not that many studies. Of course, it is this kind of classic study from the Norwegian sociologist who found that there are emotion norms. It was one of the first studies actually that looked at kind of how people, Kari Norgard, looked at how people talk about emotions, and that they were worried, but they didn't talk about it. And especially young people then felt that it was uncool to talk about your worry. But I think that has changed dramatically. Like also you have pointed out that young people today, 15 years later on, talk a lot about emotions and also mental ill-being much more than people did before. But I should just mention that I did a study with teachers when I used a theoretical perspective of meta-emotions. So there are studies in psychology looking at how you perceive your own emotions or your children's emotions. And in this case, it was teachers, how they perceive emotions in the classroom. And I kind of pinpointed different clusters of looking at it, from that it is totally irrational with emotions, you shouldn't keep it at all, to that emotions are rational, but it is dangerous to focus on worry, so you should skip to hope very fast. And then to more complex based use of emotions, that some emotions can be both positive and negative, depending upon context, and you need to. But what was prominent was that the teachers based it mostly on their own kind of private views, not on any kind of research-based knowledge that they have gotten in teacher education. So I really argue that it's important to make it more professional, to take it into teacher education also.
Yes, so I'm sorry to take space from Elin now, but I kind of briefly want to mention that this is a very interesting topic to me personally as well, and I have also discussed a bit about this with Maria. So I'm working with a colleague from Institute for Future Studies, Julia Mosquera, who is a researcher in philosophy, and we have initiated a research program about how people kind of like to examine the normativity of climate emotions, and we hope to also get some funding to also examine how people think about each other's emotions. Like, should we feel afraid? Should we feel hope? Is it wrong? Is it wrong to feel? Express them and so on, and if they can lead to, let's say, social conflicts and so on, when people don't always agree on how to feel, because we all feel differently. So it's really an important question in itself. So I'm kind of happy that it was brought up here. And now, sorry, Elin, I took some space from you, but now it's your turn. Thank you.
I don't think you took any space away. That was very important. Thank you very much, Kirsti, for that. I think what's perhaps part of the social context is for youth. Youth are self-identifying around a climate justice movement. And so therefore, these emotions sit within a political lens. It is a justice movement. And Panu was mentioning how there's not a presentation that he's been in where this issue of nuclear war hasn't come up. I think presentations can be yet another way in which we take a gauge or a feeling of what people are talking about and how that's shifting. So I would say not that long ago, when I would talk about evidence-based hope, youth would ask, they would want to talk about hope from a personal well-being standpoint, but they would feel awkward to do so because they would feel that they were somehow letting corporations off the hook, or letting, climate change would not stay top of mind issue if they were to focus in a solutions orientation. And even if I talked about how solutions orientations can hold one accountable, they are very good at holding things accountable, because if you can show what works, you can demand that it works where you are. They would still feel this tension around that. Just in the last few months, as I said, I feel like there's been a real emergence around the idea of doomism as a political ploy. And then there's the response, then we really want to talk about solutions because we don't wish to be letting them off the hook by staying in doom. And so I think that the social contexts are so always in evolution, and we must always be looking at, if it is a justice movement, then it's a political movement, and our emotions are sitting within that, and how our ideas within that political movement shifting, that too needs to somehow come into our research framing, because I think it's exciting, and it's where we see the most opportunities for intervention, because then we say, now there's a lot of interest in solutions that have merit, that have evidence, both from a well-being standpoint and from a climate engagement standpoint. This is our moment, rather than needing to convince one of the moment.
Thank you, Elin. I was wondering if the audience has any questions about what has been discussed now, or more something else about climate emotions, measurement, understanding them, and so on. If you don't have any questions, do we have something on the chat?
How to think about privilege and eco-anxiety and emotions. For example, if eco-anxiety is the main or almost only concern for someone of privilege living in a high-income country.
Well, I think that's a really important question, but I think it may be based in part, or there's often a misconception that it is people who are privileged who are most anxious, and the evidence is that at least that's not always the case. Certainly in the US, people who have less social status, people who are in minoritized, underprivileged communities, are often more anxious partly because they recognize that they are going to be the first to feel the effects of climate change. So I think, and I have seen this comment that anxiety may reflect privilege, and it may be a sense that it's sort of self-indulgent to think too much about your own emotions as opposed to getting down to work. And, you know, as a psychologist, I think many of us would say it's not self-indulgent to think about your emotions, but you don't want it to replace thinking about action. So I guess that would be my response to that question.
Okay, do we have any more comments or questions on this, or shall we go to forward?
While people are thinking, I might just comment briefly that the climate scientist Kimberly Nicholas, I think, put it well in her book that it shouldn't be a contest, you know, that whose anxiety is the most ethically valuable. And this point may need some explaining, but she was pointing out that globally we are all suffering from the crisis. It's a terrible injustice that many people don't have as many possibilities for reacting and building resilience as others do, but still it's affecting us all. So that's also one angle for it. That, for example, a teenager from Eastern Helsinki, who by global standards has more privilege than teenagers in many other countries, but still may feel that it's quite devastating to take a look at the predictions of climate science and the inaction by politicians, for example. So that's one angle. Of course, I think we also need different kinds of vocabulary for different contexts. And I'm not advocating that anxiety terms may be the best for every community around the world, but for research purposes, they seem to be useful.
Okay, so as the discussion reveals, this is a really complex and an issue that we should study further and also discuss in society and give space to different emotions and reactions. So now we have discussed quite a lot about anxiety and worry, but also hope. And we know that anxiety is quite common, but at the same time, we also know that there is also some reason to feel hope. And at the same time, it's quite difficult sometimes to feel hope. And I was thinking that we could maybe go deeper into constructive hope and meaning-focused coping and evidence-based hope, because this seems to be so beneficial. And you have mentioned some things in your talk, but I was thinking that maybe we could go into this more. How should we understand, for example, constructive hope, and how can we promote it? This might be a really interesting question for researchers and also for society. How do we find meaning in the middle of crisis? And also in some situations, it could be also difficult to say that we should feel, let's say, constructive hope when we see this political inaction, and some people don't have people around them who are working to combat climate change. And for these people, how do they kind of find meaning? And so do you have any thoughts about this theme? Okay, Elin, you can start.
Sorry, thank you. Is that better? One of the things I think is quite striking is how often people will say, I never thought about hope in relationship to climate change, because the narrative is such urgent, these are urgent issues. I'm not saying that, but it is in an urgency discourse. We have countdown clocks and all of those kinds of things. Because of that, and because of our heavy dominance on problem identification, people don't think of hope. Hope is a novel idea often for many people. And I think Kirsty, you said it well, you know, we see political inaction because that's what's reported. That's what's, you know, that's what we see in our journal articles. We don't see political action in the same way. And I think one of the really positive emergent things that's happening now is much more focus on big data analysis that can appear now in infographics that are easily graspable. So for example, as a case in point, when we experienced the horrific school shooting recently in the United States, it was CNN, I believe, who put together a very profound infographics about really showing what an outlier the US is in terms of the numbers of weapons, of guns, compared to almost every country on earth. And so in the context of that conversation, which is around a horrific incident, which is a horrific thing within a bigger issue of guns and gun violence, which is a horrific thing, it's also important to see the context of is this happening everywhere? In what ways? Where have there been successful interventions around school shootings? These kinds of discussions really change the framing of the issue. But if we were to just look at the media report, one might think that this issue is true everywhere and is now yet another example of global demise. And so I think the contextualization that we're able to see much more through big data analysis and the presentation of that in very effective infographics, to me, is one place where constructive hope is really enhanced, because we can then look at what is happening, for example, around net zero pledges and how quickly are they moving. You know, so an argument I make is we can look right now in The Economist online and see day by day what's happening with COVID vaccines around the world on a daily updated basis. We do not have the same thing for climate change. So we're left with the sense that this one indication marker, which we have, which is of global warming, is somehow telling us about what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And so I think even how we measure and present things is really critical to the emotions that we take away around these things. So I hold a lot of encouragement from watching the emergence of big data that can then be shown in these sort of infographic ways that are much more contextualized.
Yes, Maria.
Yes, yeah, I do agree with Elin that hope is not something that you mention spontaneously together with the climate change. You need to be presented to it in a questionnaire or asked about, well, do you feel hope sometimes? And then people start to think, and they can also realize that there are perhaps some hopeful aspects. But I think when it comes to promoting a more kind of constructive hope, I think that what is very obvious among the teachers that I have done studies with, but I think among others is also the misunderstanding that you should kind of, when young people then they don't talk about hope when it comes to climate change, they talk about their worry, they talk about their sadness and those things, that you should kind of jump over it and go to hopeful things like this very fast. But I think that will only make young people feel like it will increase their kind of feeling of a betrayal and the cynicism about the adult world. So in order to promote constructive hope, I think you need to be able to stay with the young people in the negative emotion and respect that and be with them. And as Susan pointed out, there are some studies now also in a US context showing that relationship and perhaps especially both parents and teachers, it is important to do that. But then there could be a tendency to kind of start ruminating and just get caught up in this kind of negative thing. And then you need to perhaps introduce this kind of help people to not get stuck, to kind of change the perspective and to see, okay, but what can you, but not force anything on people, but to facilitate. So that I think is important. So again, positive and negative emotions are not opposite, but you need to acknowledge the negative in order for the positive to arise kind of in that way.
Yes, Elin?
I just wanted to really emphasize, I so strongly agree with you, Maria. And I think one of the challenges we face is that it's almost impossible as an individual to both be trying to sound the alarm and to be moving in a prideful, emergent direction in the positive actions, have impact. And so I was thinking when Panu was talking about older people coming forward and saying, I came through that experience with nuclear weapon concerns, the student perceives that as being pandering or not hearing them. And so I think what's really important is creating these safe spaces for the students to share those emotions, the full range of emotions that they have. And at the same time, setting the context, which is sitting within evidence of the kinds of things many other people have been doing that are having a positive impact, shifting to plant-based eating, for example, which has happened on really a global scale and is having a positive impact on climate change, so that both things sit there. So it's really creating safe space for the dialogue about feelings and bringing to bear at a high enough scale the sense that these sorts of things are not just wishful thinking, they're actually happening, so that student can both feel the feelings they're feeling and see that they sit in an area of concern that others also share. So the two together are important. And I think the second one is the one that is most often lacking. It just doesn't happen. And then the student is left perhaps ruminating or those sorts of things.
So this question is also related to hope. The question comes from someone saying, the meaning-focused coping seems to make perfect sense to me. And then they go on a little more, but the question is there a danger of false hope? What are your thoughts about this?
I'll just jump in and say, I think this is exactly when the students or the young people feel like they're being pandered to, as someone tries to give them a very simple, well, here's one good thing that's happening, and it doesn't seem like that is sufficient to address the magnitude of the problem. And then they feel that, they're sort of being patted on the head and told to, calm down. And so absolutely, I think false hope, it's very appealing to want to make young people or anyone feel better, but they recognize when the hope that you're giving them in many cases it's disproportionate to the problem. And I think companies do this all the time. I've been particularly amused by a sign that I saw in cinemas back in the days when I used to go to the movie theater, and you wore the 3D glasses and you were supposed to recycle them after you saw the movie. And there was a sign that said, "Save the world, recycle your glasses." And I thought, oh, it's that easy. All I have to do. Here you have my glasses. Now there's nothing more to worry about. So I think you do get that message a lot of the time.
I would say after Maria.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Maria.
Yeah, I do agree with Susan there. But I was the question about false hope. When I have conducted studies with young people, and the one that feels hopeful, if you just ask them in a questionnaire, do you feel hopeful? And yes, they do. And then when you start to dig into what does that hopefulness consist of, you can see this meaning-focused coping. But there are some groups, also among the youngest group, 11, 12 years old, at least in Sweden, and throughout also teenage years and young adulthood, that actually build their hope on the denial, really like this kind of no, researchers are just exaggerating that, so I'm feeling hopeful and things like that. It's a very small group, but it's there. So it's kind of difficult also when you want to measure it, meaning-focused coping, in comparison with hope based on denial, especially with quantitative measures, because it's hard to take in this kind of way of seeing complexity, to go from, yes, this is a problem and I'm really worried, to, but I can see that some people, like Elin says, some politicians are doing their part, my friends are doing their part, and we can historically, it's very hard. So it's hard to measure meaning-focused coping, especially among older age group, I think. So that is something that I'm still working with to try to capture it in a good way in a quantitative sense also.
Yeah, to continue from that, thanks a lot for that. So, I think both hope and anxiety can resemble the old story about having an elephant and then people with blindfolds approaching it from different sides. And then what do they tangibly feel is the elephant, whether they are touching the tail or a big foot or some other part. So both the concepts are so wide-ranging that people can include many things in them. And then philosophical analysis on various forms of hope is one possibility to go forward, and separating, for example, very ardent optimism from a more meaning-focused hope. But I agree with Maria, that's tricky with certain methods. But it seems to me that also in the field studies among young climate activists, for example, there's more and more seen that kind of determination and finding meaning by going out and showing up and being with others, which on a sort of phenomenological level manifests aspects of what we call hope, even though that's not literally hope in the sense of optimism. I hope I'm not being too complex here, and this easily gets a bit confusing. But for me, I think experiencing meaning is a very deep aspect of hope. Finally.
Yes, and I think this is also what you have also, Maria, been discussing, the difference between hope and optimism, where hope is uncertain. It's a feeling that is connected to uncertainty, and optimism is certainty, and these are different things as well. So, but yeah, so many interesting things here, but time is running out now. And I think we need to stop discussing, but I was kind of thinking that, okay, we can discuss later. If you can stay here, we can keep talking. And chat people, I think you are welcome to, at least to me, you can send questions. Right, Panu, did you
it just came to my mind that the place where we are, Puistokadulta 4, is explicitly calling itself a house of hope and science and arts, and there's many also, I know, plans for encounter different emotions also through artistic methods and so. So I was wondering that, would you like to, Anna, for example, comment on the hope and this house, since we are here?
Yes, thank you so much that you brought it up, because this was actually an important discussion point. So that we had kind of like, that we create spaces for feeling and talking about feelings and so on. And you would love to hear about your work.
I think I need the microphone. Maybe I can sit down so it's not silly for the Zoom. Hi, my name is Anna Herlin, and I'm a colleague of Nina's who presented or wished you all welcome here in the beginning. I'm from the Tina and Antti Herlin Foundation. This house, as you heard, is still in the middle of renovation, and we have 50 architects downstairs. So I was actually just greeting one of them and missed just the previous 5 minutes of this really interesting conversation. So I'm really happy to share about their plans, but can you reformulate a question for me?
Yeah, sorry for that, Anna. We were just discussing different forms of hope, and somebody from Zoom asked that how to promote constructive hope, and another person asked that is there the problem of sometimes that young people are trying to give them false hope of, don't worry, it will be okay type of thing. And then we discussed something about meaning and encountering emotions.
Yeah, and the question was?
In Puistokadulta 4, you have labeled this a house of hope.
House of science.
So how come? Is that constructive hope, and what's your plans of?
Yes, thank you, Panu. So we have indeed named Puistokadulta 4 is the address of the street that you have heard a lot of also bypassing cars driving just now, and then we coined the term a space for science and hope to embody what our plans for the space in here. We want to connect those two in order to maintain the very solid kind of base of knowledge and scientific knowledge. I guess I was thinking today that it's like maybe there are three things that have brought us as a species here, like this far. It's the kind of the ability for logical thinking and thus kind of creating science. Then we have we have emotions, and we can even identify them and have academic discussions and all kinds of discussions at home about our emotions. And then we have the ability to imagine, which is, I think, neither of those two, but it's still something that we have as a species, and we've used those until this point, and we should. And I guess the baseline here at Puistokadu is that we should keep on using those assets that we have and try to find a path forward. So hope is maybe something in between emotions and imagining. I don't know if you agree. And I'm not at all an academic on this field. So I was sitting in the back row thinking, okay, and a discussion in English in the late Finnish afternoon, and the Finnish audience is not raising comments or questions, might have something to do also with that the physical reality that we are in. And I have indeed like no personal background except for the planning of this project. But I think we've learned a lot from talking with Panu, and of course, and the science around the entire environmental crisis. And I would just maybe, I don't like to talk about things that we plan to do but haven't done yet. So it's also one aspect. But I think we plan to test the hypothesis of whether we can use those qualities that we have to bring things forward. And we are planning a kind of a proactive approach together with Panu for the house to proactively take into account all kinds of emotions that people come with, and also we have an attic full of scientists hopefully in the fall, and I think it's also, or the feedback that we have been getting is that that's a really welcome combination of creating a space for multidisciplinary science making, and at the same time welcoming and talking openly about emotions and hopefully being emotional. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Such a great right. Or you can stay there. Oh, maybe. Oh, sorry. I will go here. Let's see. This is right. Okay. So this is like a perfect ending for the discussion. So great that you, Panu, remember and yeah, so wonderful to hear. And thank you so much for creating this place and giving this space, this opportunity to people. So thank you so much for being here. Thank the audience, also the chat audience, and thank you so much for our wonderful presenters, talkers who shared the research and their insights about research as well. And thank you, Isabel, as well. And thank you, the technician who has been doing great work with this. So, okay, so applaud maybe. Okay, so okay, then we can maybe end this discussion. Let's keep talking and researching about